What's up, Game Gurus? I rewatched Lord of the Rings the other day, and it got me thinking, what a treasure trove of inspiration movies can be. Today I want to focus on Helms Deep specifically, and I want to see what lessons can we draw from it that we can apply to your own encounters. Let's roll. First up, we're going to talk about creating the dramatic arc. So the dramatic arc, the shape of the arc, is pretty much down and then spikes up at the end. But as it's going down, there's little moments of hope. Or it comes up a bit, but it's trending down. Starting with the hook. So the hook is the Uruk-hai army that's coming. That's an unavoidable threat that the protagonists have to react to. In your campaign, you're going to want to have some sort of hook that's close to as strong as that. It has to be something that the protagonists feel like they need to respond to. To make it feel like it's not railroading, though, you're going to have to make sure that it's weaved into the narrative seamlessly. If it feels like you thought, oh, this is cool, I want to try this in my campaign, and you just kind of force it in there, probably not going to land very well. So make sure it flows effortlessly out of your narrative. Try to set it up. The seed for Helms Deep was planted throughout the film beforehand, and it's going to be the same with your campaign. There should be some sort of enemy that is capable of putting the kind of pressure the Uruk-hai do on your players. They should be, the players should be aware of them maybe a session or two before this last stand happens. And that's going to allow you to bring this encounter about in a way that feels less railroady. Okay, so next we have Rising Despair. So Rising Despair is something that happens throughout the arc. It's bad thing after bad thing happening. Aragorn brings the bad news. Legolas is losing hope. Hama is talking about how all the soldiers are feeling hopeless. Theoden's talking about the end. Then you have the False Dawn. So the False Dawn is the moment where the elves arrive. So it's like kind of a major spike of hope before things get really bad. Next up you have the Conflict. Conflict is the entire Battle of Helm's Deep. This is where now you kind of have the main sort of downward trending but fluctuating arc. But the heroes are having all these moments where they're doing heroic things, and there's moments of levity, like, Legolas's and Gimli's banter about their competition to slay more orcs, or Gimli asking to be tossed, etc. The little moments of levity and heroism are going to help your players kind of bolster themselves against the battle that doesn't seem to be going in their favor. And because D&D and any TTRPG really is collaborative, whereas writing a film, there's one sort of creative voice in a way for a film, but with D&D, that's not the case. You don't have to engineer every single moment, but you just want to be aware that this part should have some little upticks, and you can supply some. Your players are going to be doing cool stuff. Reward them, allow for these little upticks to happen, even though the battle's trending down. Next up, we have the Darkest Hour. The Darkest Hour is where Theoden gives up. He says, the fortress is taken, it is over. When the king gives up, that's when it's at its worst. It doesn't take very long, maybe 30 seconds or so, until you go into the next section, the Ray of Hope. So the Ray of Hope in the film is a literal ray, sun ray, coming through the window with Gandalf's voiceover. And one thing that's interesting about the way they do this in the film is they do a bit of misdirection to really get the audience to feel what the characters are feeling. If you're not careful, audiences know that the protagonists typically have plot armor, right? So the trick is to get them to forget it. And the Ents serve this purpose in the film. I've watched a number of reaction videos to the film, and I've noticed that pretty consistently people think that the Ents are going to be what saves the day. When they go to Isengard, that's when they really start to go, oh shit, maybe our heroes are not going to get out of it. Even though if they step back, broke out of the illusion and thought about it, they'd be like, well, yeah, okay, it's a Hollywood movie. They're not gonna just all die. But when they're in it, they kind of forget, and that's masterful storytelling, I think. They don't mention Éomer or Gandalf at all in the second half of the movie. That allows the audience to really connect with the characters and feel the hopelessness that is kind of encroaching upon the protagonists. In your campaign, you're going to want to be a little bit careful about laying on hopelessness and despair too thickly, because your players are real people, whereas characters are like puppets of the writer. So you want to attenuate it, keeping in mind your players' tolerance to this. It should be fun for them. The more that you're able to bring it down, the sweeter it's going to be when you pay it off in the end and they get out of it. All right. So, and then the final part of the arc is victory. And this is the payoff. This is the nice, like, this is the sweet moment at the end where reinforcements arrive, the heroes are victorious. So you really need to know ahead of time what is going to be the savior for the players. You might want to have the players do it themselves. In Helms Deep, it's an outside element that comes in and rescues them. However it happens, you want to make sure that there isn't some sort of way that they could have pulled it off earlier. It has to only be possible near the end of the arc. Just to reiterate, the general idea is just to have it going down so that you can spike it way up at the end. You want to have despair and hopelessness increasing, but at the end, pay it off with a glorious victory. To kind of mitigate, prevent people from getting feeling way too low, you have all these moments where you're kind of bolstering them and bringing them back up a little bit, giving them little moments of heroism or levity, and moments where it seems like, well, maybe there's a little something that's happening that can bolster them. All right. So next up, we're going to look at designing the battle. In Helm's Deep, the battle is broken up into several phases. You start out with a prep phase, and we're going to skip over that for now. Then there's a number of battle phases. So you've got the assault on the walls, the battle in the breach, the battle for the gate, and then the sally out. So each of these phases is occurring in a different setting. They all occur in the fortress, but each one occurs in a specific part of the fortress. From a D&D perspective, you're going to want to have a battle map for each phase. You could try having a battle map for the entire fortress, but in my experience, this tends to limit your creative freedom. You're not going to be able to select from as many of the maps that are out there. When you play with your encounter and you're going through the creative process, trying different things, if you like one part of the fortress but not the other, you're up shit creek without a paddle. So focus your battle maps in on a particular area. Don't try to do too much. So now let's take a look at what your phase is going to consist of. In my opinion, the best place to start with designing the encounter is the enemies. The enemies are what your players are interacting with. They're the most dynamic part of the encounter. I think the best place to start with your enemies is to have some sort of idea of like what's their character, what's their personality. You don't have to have like a 10-page backstory for every Urukai, right? But you want to have a general idea of what they're like. So for Urukai, you might write down a few descriptive words like they're ruthless, but they're disciplined, they're strong, they're very organized, being led by Saruman, etc. And these qualities are going to help you a lot, both in making them feel more real for players, but also it's going to help you understand what all the other aspects of their design are going to be. More concretely, when you think about what their strategy is going to be, what their composition is going to be, how they react to different things the players do, that's going to be informed by their character. So for the Urukai, their strategy is very aggressive, but pretty clever because of Saruman. That's something that can make your encounter a little more interesting, right? Like they're not showing any compassion for their fellow soldiers. They're knocking each other off the ramp as they bring the ram up, but they have very clear plans as how to breach each defense. And this creates like an interesting uniqueness to the encounter that your players are now grappling with. In the film, they don't really have a large variety of enemy composition, and that's fine for what they did. It wasn't necessary. But for a campaign, you're probably going to want to have a bit more variety, give your players something more to interact with. So here you have all your classics, right? Your spellcasters, your tanks, crowd controllers. Think about the different roles that the enemies are going to occupy and try to weave that in with their character. Your battle phase, once you've got your enemies down and you've figured out what your map is going to be, you know roughly how the battle's going to go because you're thinking about how the phases connect to each other. You're going to want to think about the transitions, the in-between bits. For each of the phases, you want to have a little bit of room before and after to roleplay. You can draw from Helm's Deep with this. Before the assault starts, Gimli and Legolas are bantering on the wall, And that's the kind of moment that you're going to want to allow for your players. And that's going to really help break up the session so that it's not just combat, 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 combat. Then you're going to want to think about your transition. For the assault on the wall, you have a gunpowder device that blows a breach in the wall. That's sort of the culminating event. And from there, your players and their characters are going to have to get to the next phase. Put a little thought into how you're going to achieve this beforehand, because again, drawing from the film, if they're on the wall, there's still Uruk-hai left alive up there, and they're fighting them. How are they going to get down to the breach to have the battle down there? You want to think about maybe having some dice rolls, or depending what the players do, you have a few ideas of narratively how they're going to get there, instead of trying to have that happen as part of D&D battle mechanics. That's going to be more interesting. It's going to allow you to fluidly move to the next phase, much more than if you make them do it using turns and movement speed and all that. So now that we've talked about the battle phases, I want to get back to the preparation phase. So the reason I left this till after the battle phases, even though it occurs before, is because once you know what your battles are going to be, you're going to have a better idea of what kind of elements there are going to be present that your players can use to prepare. For Helms Deep, say, you know that, okay, there are elves that have very good archers. The Rohan army has some like heavy infantry. They have some archers of their own, so you can think about allowing your players to deploy forces if that's something you're into. You can have them have some great role play moments interacting with NPCs to achieve this. So if your party is Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn, they can be interacting with the NPC of Theoden to suggest courses of action, like maybe you should put troops here or put them there. Not every party is going to care about the deployment. They're more interested in the narrative, but I think some will, and it can also very much be part of the narrative. So make sure there's some room for them to do that. You can also think about material that they can prepare. This isn't Helms Deep, but I once had a really fun Last Stand Helms Deep sort of scenario with a friend of mine who was jamming, where we defended against a bunch of trolls that were attacking a hilltop. And, we cut down a few trees. We knew they were coming. We tried to prepare defenses. We left gaps in certain places to try to funnel them. We had some like bombs and things from previous sessions, and we used those in choke points. And so all that kind of stuff makes the players feel more involved in what happens. So give them some things that they can change. Give them some material that they can use and move and manipulate. One other aspect that is going to play a little bit into the design of your encounters that I think is really good to think about is anticipating moments for your players, giving them opportunities to shine. I think you can do this in mechanical ways by knowing what your players' characters are good at. For instance, if you have a tank in the party, very high AC, high HP, give them a moment where they can really make use of that and play a role that no other party member could pull off. A good example would be Gimli and Aragorn on the bridge, where they're holding off the Uruk-hai to allow the Rohan soldiers to repair the gate. Here you have a swarm of enemy soldiers against very high AC, high HP Gimli and maybe Aragorn. This gives them a moment to really showcase what their character is good at. Tanks are good against swarms and in choke points. I'm sure you can think of other ways to make a tank shine, but that's a great one. If you've got nukers, high damage AoE, casters, for instance, give them swarms of low HP enemies to just obliterate on open ground. As a former sorcerer player, I can attest that this simple thing can be quite satisfying. If you've got rogues or some kind of high damage single target type of character, give them really important officers or important high HP single enemy that they can take out. I think it's also good to think about your support characters. Maybe they use crowd control, or they buff, or they debuff. Whatever your supports are good at, try to think of opportunities that they could have to use what they're good at, same as all the other character archetypes. So if they're good at AoE crowd control, then let them create an area where they can cast Entangle and they can stall the assault for a bit. Or just really think about what are my characters good at, or what are my players' characters good at, and what kinds of things can I add to the map, add to the enemies that give them opportunities to showcase that. So the last thing that I really want to talk about is dealing with demoralization. One of the tricky things about running this type of encounter is that you're going to be, the idea is to kind of put as much pressure as you can on your party as they're willing to take, so that when they pull out the victory in the end, it's just that much sweeter. But the problem with that is that if you're really playing it close to the edge, because there's randomness in the game, the randomness can sometimes swing it over. Maybe it seemed like, yeah, this is going to be tough for them, but I think I balanced it. It's going to